The Hungarian government, led by Viktor Orbán, has invested a significant amount of time and money into building alliances both in the EU and the US. However, instead of maintaining traditional diplomatic ties, Viktor Orbán seems to focus more on establishing partnerships with political actors that are close to him ideologically. Can we speak of foreign influence-building efforts by the Hungarian government? What are the goals of Viktor Orbán's international networking? What are the outcomes of these efforts? Has Hungary's weight on the international stage increased? Which topics and events have had a major impact on the influence-building process? How has Russia's latest aggression against Ukraine affected Hungary's international perception and alliance-building capability? What can we expect for the next 1.5–2 years? These were the guiding questions of a recent study on Hungarian influence that we at Political Capital conducted with the support of the Prague office of the Heinrich Böll Foundation. And these will also be the questions that we will discuss in today's podcast episode that we record online on the 13th of December 2022.
Listening to the podcast of Political Capital Institute.
I'm Bulcsú Hunyadi, Senior Analyst with Political Capital, and my guests today are Flóra Garambölgyi, a US-based Hungarian journalist covering the relations between Fidesz and the Republican Party for The Guardian, and Zsuzsanna Vég, visiting fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States and associate researcher at the European Council on Foreign Relations. Flóra, Zsuzsa, a very warm welcome to this episode. I'm really glad you're with us today. Let's start with a basic question. Can we speak at all of foreign influence building efforts with regards to Hungary? Has this really been happening? And if yes, is it linked to the Hungarian state or rather to the governing party Fidesz?
I think that's a really good way of phrasing this question because, of course, there is Hungarian influence building and it's a very obvious task and function of every state to try to build influence on the international stage. But I think what we see in the case of Hungary, not independent of the fact that we have had the same government for the past 12 years, is that the lines are very much blurred between the influence building of the state and of the party. And by now, I would actually argue that what we see is the takeover of international influence building by the governing party Fidesz, as opposed to having an independent influence building by the Hungarian state on the international scene.
I agree with Zsuzsanna completely. I think it's about the governing party. And I think it's interesting to see how it's overreaching the definition of traditional diplomacy in this case. In the case of traditional diplomacy, the goal is to maintain peaceful relations between two countries. But what we are seeing here is, in the case of the US, is the American conservatives looking at Hungary as a model. And this is mainly the result of the 2015 migrant crisis and the way Orbán chose to frame it. His words resonated with a large group of Republicans. However, I believe it was in 2018, after Trump was elected, that America as a whole started to notice this massive story that was about how democracy can collapse in just a couple of years in the heart of the European Union. In that sense, one part of America is now looking at Hungary as a warning sign of how fragile democracy can be, but the other half of is looking at it as an example to follow. And we are seeing the results of just by looking at Florida, for example, the Don't Say Gay bill, which is essentially a copy of the Hungarian anti-LGBT law.
Thanks, Flóra and Zsuzsi. Flóra, you just dived into the details of Hungarian-US relations, or to better put it, Hungarian relations to Republicans in the US. Zsuzsi, how do you see the relations within the EU? Like, who are kind of the target groups or target personalities of Viktor Orbán's efforts to build Hungarian influence within the European Union?
In the case of the European Union, I think we see a major shift. There is a clear reorientation, especially over the past few years, but already starting, as Flora also pointed to, the 2015 refugee and migrant crisis. There is a shift away from the party's traditional partners, mainly the mainstream right conservative parties within the European Union, towards parties that are much rather located on the far right of the political spectrum, mostly those which could be described as populist radical right parties. If you look at the European Parliament, parties that are sitting in the currently the Identity and Democracy political group, as well as the European Conservatives and Reformists. So there is a clear reorientation from the mainstream towards the radical right, I would say. That's one thing. So there is this ideological component of intra-EU coalition building. But within the EU, we also see additional layers of influence building. There's, of course, the economic dimension, which is not necessarily party-oriented externally. Of course, it's party-driven internally, and it's connected to the business entourage of the governing party. And then there is the influence building directly in the neighborhood of Hungary, targeting the Hungarian minority and its organizations, which is directly connected to Fidesz's so-called Nemzetpolitika, nations politic, if we want to do a rough translation. So the policy targeting the ethnic minority and building ties with this group. So I think in the case of the EU, it's definitely a multi-layered process and strategy that has evolved over time.
So you both mentioned 2015 as a major milestone in the influence building efforts of the Orbán government or Orbán regime. What do you think, or how would you describe the goals of these influence building efforts? Has it changed since 2015? What are the current goals of these efforts? What do you think?
I think in the Euro-Atlantic alliance system, the US and the EU, the Orbán regime wants to see the political mainstream fall and to help change the social and cultural hegemony. As Viktor Orbán repeatedly stated in recent years, he doesn't want to leave the EU, he wants to change it. He does not believe that the strategy of the West is working, and he sees himself as a leader that can change it for the better. He had a famous controversial speech this year where he shared his vision of a culturally and ethnically homogeneous Judeo-Christian Europe where there is a bigger emphasis on national sovereignty. He also spoke about that he rejects the idea of PC culture, and that is also something that resonates with many on the far right in the US, and also I think in Europe, where political correctness is seen as a form of censorship. So I think there are layers here, but the most important is an ideology-based influence building of Orbán and his party. But of course, the other layers are the media and the media influence building, and of course, economic influence building as well.
I would completely agree with Flora in the importance of ideology in Fidesz's alliance building. I think, however, the ideology is both a means and an end when it comes to essentially seeking out new allies. Because one of the main goals that Fidesz here pursues, and it has to pursue after pretty much falling out of the mainstream right cooperation over the past years, is to demonstrate that it is an internationally relevant player, both on the international scene, but also towards the domestic audience. And for this, using the radical rights ideology, certain elements of the radical rights ideology, I think is an important rallying tool to seek out new partners, and especially that this ideology resonates with at least a wing of the American Republicans, which could be an important ally. But also there are many actors where it resonates in Europe. But also there are, of course, elements of the ideology that are pursued as a goal. And here I'm thinking of the socioculturally conservative positions as well, and vision of society as well. So I think in this sense, ideology serves here a dual purpose overall. But when it comes to strategy, just one more thought on that, I think this alliance building serves the purpose really of positioning Hungary as an important player, at least on the European scene, to pursue the goal of Viktor Orbán to make Hungary essentially shoot above its weight in European politics. And for that, he is relying on allies who are, similarly to him, are disruptive in international politics and therefore can rally around the same flag.
Thanks. In our study, which we recently published on the Hungarian influence building efforts, we actually assessed also a goal according to which the main strategic goal of Viktor Orbán is actually to maintain his power in Hungary. And the international influence building efforts mainly serve this goal by, creating a friendly international environment to help other ideologically similar parties in other countries to get into government, to have a seat at the European Council table, for instance. So it's on the one hand, it's a very pragmatic approach, I think, or I would say, as I said, mainly based on domestic political interests and goals. On the other hand, you both mentioned ideology many times. And we can definitely see that, Viktor Orbán's main partners are those politicians and parties that have very similar ideological line. So how do you see kind of pragmatism and ideology, like the relation between pragmatism and ideology in Viktor Orbán's efforts to build international influence?
Actually, this is where I think that ideology is instrumentalized. Exactly what you're saying, that it serves, alliance building also serves the purpose of maintaining Viktor Orbán's essentially grip on power domestically. And what I mean by this is that if we look at it, one of the core elements of the radical right's ideology is the primacy of the nation state and the primacy of national sovereignty. And if we look at the policy line of the Hungarian government, we see that on the international stage, it pursues a policy of kind of non-interference into each other's domestic affairs, that is, upholding the state's sovereign right to determine what happens domestically. And there is a clear utilitarian match here, I would say, with the radical right's pursuit of national sovereignty and primacy of national sovereignty, even when it comes to international cooperation. And here fits the vision about a European Union, an EU of nation states, as opposed to an ever deeper union, which is what the former is what the Orbán government would pursue, where it seeks out those allies that regard the same configuration as the goal and fit ideologically. So I do agree with your point, and this is where I think ideology is instrumentalized.
I agree with you completely. And I think it's interesting to add that the way Hungary is building influence in other countries is largely different from what we are seeing from other European countries, because it's not just about building great relations, but about magnifying the differences between the different ideological groups and creating division. It's about building alliances against something. Let's say how Orbán framed the alliance between Poland and Hungary, or the alliance between Turkey and Hungary. Orbán's government is also using the obstruction of the international decisions such as vetoes as a tool. And the other successful method was their communication campaigns and their taboo-defying rhetoric that is both echoing and copying other right-wing politicians. And last but not least, lobbying. I think that was also an interesting thing to see how Orbán lobbied here in the US and the way some lobbying firms completed the tasks that are traditionally done by diplomats.
Right. And speaking of the practical efforts to build influence, as you mentioned, Flora, for instance, lobbying or campaigns, how do you see the balance of these efforts? Like, what are the outcomes of these efforts? How is the Hungarian government, Viktor Orbán, perceived in the US? How is he perceived in the EU, among the mainstream parties, but also among his ideological allies?
I would say here in America, it was very successful because the American right and the Hungarian right have become open admirers of each other. And in this case, it's an admiration from people in power, such as the leadership of the Republican Party or former President Donald Trump. And I would also add that Orbán also benefits from this domestically because he can say that even the world's most powerful country is paying attention to what he says and that they are viewing him as a model.
I think in the European Union, we see a very mixed picture. So when it comes to the mainstream right, Fidesz's earlier traditional partners, I think there is by now a clear break. And both the party and the Prime Minister Orbán are viewed negatively and rather as a troublemaker. And if we look at also Hungary's record when it comes to cooperation in the European Union or the EU's foreign policy, Hungary is viewed among foreign policy circles or in foreign policy circles rather as a disappointing partner. But definitely when it comes to the radical right, Orbán is a very attractive politician, not only among the smaller up-and-coming parties like the Estonian EKRE or Tomio Okamura's Freedom and Direct Democracy in the Czech Republic, which are relatively newer players, but also among the staples of radical right politics. For example, Lega in Italy, Rassemblement National in France. By now, he is an accepted player among these circles. And as recent alliance buildings show, he is also looking at these parties and politicians as his key allies, which is a big shift away from the earlier alliance buildings of the party, signaling a very obvious, clear drift to the far right.
And if we look at these efforts, not only from the point of view of Hungary's international influence, but also from the point of view of Fidesz's party's interests, we can also see that these international networking efforts have actually benefited the party also in terms of very, practical things like narratives or keywords or slogans. So it seems that these actors learn from each other a lot, share their experiences. How do you see that in the US and also in the EU?
I think within the EU, that's absolutely true. And here the watershed point is definitely the refugee and migration crisis. That is the time from where we do see significant approximation in the rhetoric of the radical right parties in Western Europe and in Central and Eastern Europe. So essentially what we see is Central and Eastern European radical right parties, including Fidesz, has adopted the same toolkit, focusing on immigration and especially Muslim immigration as a threat to Europe, calls for the protection of Europe as a Christian, Judeo-Christian continent, and this sort of diffusion of rhetorical elements across the continent, I think, was essential to actually contribute to the alliance building of these parties between Central and Eastern Europe and Western Europe. So this is a big shift from the time before when actually those parties that Fidesz is now, for example, cooperating with were regarding Central and Eastern Europe as a potential burden on Europe, on their countries, especially like migrants from Central and Eastern Europe. If we look at back to the 2000s, one of the reasons why alliance building at that time between such forces failed was because of the differences and the animosity that Western European radical right parties were harboring towards Central and Eastern European nations. So definitely there is this approximation and diffusion.
One of the most interesting things for me is the language these political groups used. When you were talking about, for example, migration or Christian democracy, all of these expressions, and to see these expressions getting a political note and how they started to use them on both sides of the Atlantic. So let's just take the word woke. It's clearly an import from the American ideological wars. But now Hungarian politicians are using it as an inside joke with their supporters as well, in English. It's not even the Hungarian equivalent of the word woke. Or let's just take fake news. That's another great example of that. But I think it's even more exciting if we're looking at the tropes Orbán is using in his speeches, not only certain words. When we remember of this controversial speech that he did in the spring this year, he was quoting lines from a book called The Camp of the Saints. That's a French novel. And this is a book that is a must-read among white supremacists, far-right politicians, figures such as Marine Le Pen, Stephen Miller, Steve Bannon, or Steve King. All these politicians are using the same tropes from this book. And this book was the inspiration for the book called The Great Replacement and the Great Replacement Theory. And it is full of these tropes that we are hearing from far-right politicians for the past years. For example, speaking about asylum seekers as a violent rhetoric of migrant invasion that must be stopped before it conquers white America, or in Orbán's case, Christian Hungary. And it's also interesting how he uses the word Christian and Christian democracy, because it's not about religion. It translates to something that is illiberal and anti-immigration. And we are seeing the effects of these speeches and these kind of like book recommendations by these far-right leaders in Hungary and in the US as well, and all over the world. If we're looking at mass shootings, all the mass shooters for the past years, not all of them, but many of them were referring to these books and these ideological ideas that these politicians mentioned, specifically the Great Replacement Theory that inspired so many mass shootings. So these speeches are not only having an effect on a political level or on politicians, but they are having an effect in real life. And they are having quite devastating consequences.
You both mentioned the impact or effect of immigration on Viktor Orbán's policies and also politics and political strategy, and also the role of immigration for right-wing radical, right-wing extremist, far-right movements and parties, both in the US and in Hungary. And also you mentioned at the beginning of our discussion that 2015 was kind of a major milestone in Viktor Orbán's governance, ideology, policies, and also in terms of his influence building efforts. Do you see any other major events that have had an impact on Hungary's image or Hungary's perception or Viktor Orbán's perception, either in the EU or in the US, like besides 2015 and besides the topic of immigration?
I would say his family policies, his anti-LGBT law, and I think his kind of like ideological war against BC. These were three important topics that resonated here with Americans on the right.
I think so far we were mentioning quite a few topics that were facilitating alliance building and the pursuit of spreading Hungarian influence. I think an important turning point, which actually has the quite opposite impact, unlike the refugee and migration crisis, is the February invasion of Ukraine by Russia, which actually highlighted that despite those many similarities, even when we look at the far right and the potential allies of Viktor Orbán, there are still issues that fundamentally divide them, and this definitely undercuts the alliance building efforts of Fidesz. And in this light, we also see that even cooperation with the closest ally of Fidesz, with the Polish Law and Justice Party, has come to quite a halt. Probably relations have never been as frosty as they are now between Fidesz and PIS. And this is something that actually hampers the alliance building that Fidesz was pursuing to bring together the factions of identity and democracy and the European conservatives and reformists into a broader new right political group within the European Union. So as opposed to the previous opportunities that were supporting Orbán's quest, the war on Ukraine is actually something that hampers it and points into a different direction.
Now that you mentioned Ukraine, I think it's important and interesting to note that both on the Republican side and I think both in the Hungarian pro-government media, a frequent topic is the aid that goes to Ukraine and the criticism against these aids and how these funds should be revised, how these funds are spent, and if they are spent the right way. This is something that I'm hearing frequently, both in the Hungarian pro-government media and in the pro-Republican media here in the US. And it's becoming the mainstream idea in the Republican Party slowly.
Thanks for this very important addition. I wanted to ask you actually anyway about how you described in detail how the current war in Ukraine hampers Viktor Orbán's efforts to bring the nationalist, right-wing populist parties into a kind of coalition or alliance within the European Parliament. How actually the Hungarian government's stance towards Ukraine has impacted the relations, for instance, with the Republican Party in the US. Viktor Orbán has been following a pretty pro-Kremlin policy, pro-Kremlin narratives for a couple of years, which is a major, I think, probably a major burden, or could be a major burden for Democrats and also Republicans in the US in terms of their relation with the Hungarian government. Has it had an impact on the Republican Party, on how the Republican Party perceives Viktor Orbán's government currently?
No, I don't think the focus here was on his relationship with Putin. And I think it's interesting to see how the Republicans are cherry picking when it comes to Hungary. They're really focusing on the common themes, on their unity and the topics that they agree on. And they are really avoiding certain topics that they are clearly have different policies on. Let's say, tax or gun rights or abortion rights. And I think when it comes to Russia, it's also interesting to know how the pro-Republican media is covering the topic. Let's say the Tucker Carlson show, which, is under criticism for its sometimes pro-Russia notes or comments. But I don't think when it comes to the Republican Party and the pro-Orbán and pro-Trump wing of the Republican Party that Orbán's ties to Putin and the Kremlin are the main focus here. I think they were glad to see a country that they can view as a model and they can describe to their voters as a place where conservative ideas can thrive. So yeah, that's an interesting question. And I think some Republican politicians asked this question that you have asked before, but I think the pro-Trump wing is not focusing on Orbán's ties to Russia.
Zsuzsi, you mentioned previously how the war affects Viktor Orbán's alliance building efforts. But on the other hand, we can also see that, for instance, in terms of rule of law issues, the Polish governing party is still allied to some extent, at least, with Fidesz, even though they have very crucial differences with regards to stance towards the Kremlin stance towards Russia. How do you see how the Hungarian government's pro-Kremlin's policies affect its relations towards certain parties or certain governments within the EU, like, for instance, the Polish governing party, but also, for instance, the new Italian government, Lega, and also Giorgia Meloni, Fratelli Italia. They seem to be a key ally for Viktor Orbán. Nevertheless, Giorgia Meloni follows a quite different policy in terms of Russia or towards Russia than Viktor Orbán.
Yes, I think this still goes and will continue to go on multiple tracks. So when it comes to pursuing a nationalist, nation-centric vision and type of cooperation within the European Union, those parties which also fundamentally hold similar values on national sovereignty will continue to ally with Viktor Orbán's Fidesz, simply because this is still a uniting interest where they in turn also expect Orbán's support when push comes to shove. But this is an issue that is very much at the core of these parties' policies that will continue to ally them, but this is also very limited. And especially when it comes to law and justice, although this issue remains on the agenda, I think what is very significant is that other issues that were previously pursued are much less present. High-level state visits have not really been happening over the past half year or even more by now. Even in the V4 format, we recently did see a meeting on the level of prime ministers, but it was pretty much to push Orbán to fall in line on the EU's assistance on Ukraine. When it comes to Italy, I think Orbán probably overestimated how much of an ally Meloni would be. And we see a level of moderation since the government formation in Italy from her side. So in the current context, I think although some of the core issues, which are really core to these parties' ideology and to their vision about Europe, which are also very self-serving in every case, will remain, but these are not really constructive policy shaping elements on the agenda. In a way, this is still what Flora was mentioning, aligning against something and not for something. It's not setting the agenda, but blocking the agenda. And through this approach, I don't think you can really be a constructive, influential player in the European Union in the sense that you are influential by blocking. You are not influential by actually creating something.
Right, thank you. I would like to finish up with an outlook. What's your take on the upcoming 2 years? What can we expect? What will happen? In 2024, there will be EP elections. There will also be US elections. There will be elections in Hungary. And also there will be Hungarian EU presidency. So it's going to be a pretty important year for actually all the most important kind of international stakeholders. How do you see the kind of future of the Hungarian influence building efforts or the future of Hungarian international networking up until 2024?
Orbán expressed his support to Donald Trump multiple times over the past years. He was an early Trump supporter, endorsing him as early as summer 2016. He also publicly backed him in a 2020 vote. But this year, the US midterm elections went poorly for Trump and for Trump candidates. And the results will have consequences for all illiberal leaders around the world, including Viktor Orbán, because he pinned all his hopes on Trump and Trump supported candidates. So I believe he has to look for other Republican allies in the US, and he has to build other relationships here than just Trump-backed candidates. That's for sure what we are seeing from the midterms.
I'm sorry, Flor, a very quick follow-up question. While Trump may be gone by 2024, there are signs that Trumpism will not be gone. So there may be other, candidates who may follow a very similar ideological and policy line than Trump did. Assuming that it can be the case, how do you see Viktor Orbán's efforts or potential in building up connections or building up new alliances with other kind of illiberal, populist, Trumpist candidates in the US?
I think he has been building strong connections with Florida politicians as well. So I don't think that would be the main issue. I think it's the way he's going to communicate it domestically as well. Because I think for Orbán, it was a strong message that Trump was elected president, and he had similar messages to his voters to Orbán. And I think the way he's going to frame it domestically is one of the most important questions here if Trump is not going to win. I think he's going to continue his strong lobbying efforts here in the US because he has seen success from that, and also his influence in the Republican-backed media, where he also could prove his relevance as a strong world leader.
When it comes to the European Union, I think there are maybe even more unknown variables. The European parliamentary elections are about a year and a half away, and the Hungarian EU presidency is also in the second half of 2024. So that's still quite some time. However, what I think is very clear at the moment is that by now there is no way back for Orbán and Fidesz to the European mainstream, right? I think those channels have closed, especially following Russia's attack on Ukraine in February and the Hungarian government's subsequent response and very unconstructive attitude in European policymaking when it comes to sanctioning Russia and supporting Ukraine. So I think that has definitely left a mark. Now, when it comes to alliance building on the far right or populist right, I think as long as the war is unfortunately on the table, this will have the otherwise fortunate effect of dividing the radical right forces in the European Union, which will continue to hamper their cooperation. So I do not see, under the current circumstances, the type of merger between ID and ECR that Orbán imagined he would be able to deliver on. This also shows in the fact that he is increasingly drifting towards the parties of identity and democracy, which are much more the radical right ones than the conservative ones. So I think whereas these forces could potentially still strengthen ahead of the 24 EP elections, I do not expect, although many things can change in a year and a half, but I would not expect that they would really be as influential as Orbán would like it to see. However, since the EP will be essentially setting up and the new commission will be forming under the Hungarian EU presidency, that could be an interesting dynamic. And in that regard, I would expect the Hungarian government, if Orbán still will be in power, and I think we can expect that's going to be the case, not to really be a constructive player in the interinstitutional power struggles. But what will be on the agenda, that's obviously very hard to tell at the moment. But I think given Hungary's current reputation, this is definitely not an EU presidency that many European partners are looking forward to.
Thank you. So one of the key lessons is that the next 2 years or next 1.5 years are going to be most probably pretty much challenging for Viktor Orbán on the international stage, both in the US and in the EU. Thank you so much, Flora and Zsuzsi, for being with us, for your interesting insights and exciting discussion, and also for helping us and our listeners better understand Orbán's efforts to build alliances and influence abroad. And also many thanks to our listeners for their attention. Please keep following Political Capital's work and podcasts published on our website and social media sites. See you next time. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.